All right, this is show number 103, recorded on January 21st, 2014. And tonight we have Don Komarechka.
Komarechka.
How,
There you
how
go.
close was I?
There's the correction.
Tim
You're
said it
very
right.
close.
Tim said it right. Rejoining us. He was back on show number 86 or so, I believe,
Yes.
when we did our first macro show. And he has some incredible snowflakes and other macros, but incredible snowflakes. And Don, you're about right in the middle right now of 100 days of posting a different snowflake every day, right?
And so I'm just a few days past the midpoint in that project. Every winter, this is the third year in a row, I've edited and posted a snowflake photograph online every day. And for those that don't know the process, there's about 4 hours of editing involved in each one. And so doing one every day is more than just going out and taking a picture like your standard 365 or a project like that. There's a significant time sink in getting that project underway. And so I set an arbitrary deadline of midnight every day to get mine up and posted, and I've hit it almost every day so far. Let's hope that continues.
Yeah, well, that's amazing. Right now we have your webpage pulled up. Oh, not the webpage. They have your Google Plus page pulled up where you're posting these, right?
Yeah, and so you can see, and I upload the high resolution versions of the images as well, and so you can click in and zoom in and see all the details because you'd be surprised that the detail never ends. And I've been experimenting with some pretty extreme macro work this past year, getting all the way up to 12:1 life size, and the laws of physics, the way that light bends doesn't work in the favor of a photographer at that point. Your limitations are the physics of light. And so there's more detail beyond that, but that's pretty much the most detail that can be captured by a camera. And it's kind of fun to play with those limitations and those extremes.
Yeah, and if you're not following Don, he's over on Google Plus. We'll put the link out in the show notes, but he posts a lot of stuff there, and it's good to follow him not only for the snowflakes but for other things he does. And he has 48 more of these to post. Right? You've done 50. You've done 52, or you got 52s today.
52 is sort of in the oven right now.
Okay.
I was working on it before this call, and so almost as soon as we're done, it'll be posted.
Okay. I'm looking at now on our YouTube channel. It was show number 86. If you wanted to see his macro, where he goes into more detail about those snowflake shots and some other shots, go to our YouTube channel or to our page, jpeg2RAW.com, and just search for Don, and you'll see the macro show we did back in June, I believe it was, 7 months ago. Lots going on since 7 months ago. That's hard to believe.
Yeah, well, it's 7 months ago. I started, just about 7 months ago, I started experimenting with infrared photography, which is the subject of today's episode.
Yep.
And it's been one hell of a journey, experimenting and learning a lot more about light and the way that light works beyond what we can see. And that's kind of I'll say that's my main inspiration in photography is sort of exploring and finding things that I can't normally see or that are beyond what I'd normally look at in the world. And it's a great learning tool. And for me, of a fairly technical-minded photographer, it's wonderful to learn all of these new techniques. And hopefully we can share a bit of that today.
Yeah, and so you were the first photographer to come on and first guest to come on and talk about macro. And another subject I've been waiting to do for a long time because I just have not found a person I wanted to talk to about it. It doesn't seem to be growing in popularity like I thought it when I first came across infrared photography. But when we were talking with Don last time, I saw some of his images that were just amazing for infrared, and I said we got to get you on at some point on infrared. And so Don is second time on the show, second time discussing a topic we've never talked about. So maybe we should start off with what is infrared photography?
Well, infrared photography, at least when photographers talk about it, is generally talking about near infrared, which is the deepest reds that human vision can see, and then dipping below that into what light spectrum would be invisible to us. And so this sort of fringe light that's just below what we can see with our own eyes is what a camera can capture. And in fact, a camera can capture that and what's above it as well, above into the ultraviolet. And so, infrared specifically is the capture of those wavelengths of light that normally we can't see, but a specially modified camera can see, or with a special filter and a little bit of know-how, you can make images that way as well.
Okay. So wait, it's not X-ray vision where I can see through girls' clothes?
In some ways, it might be actually, and that it's interesting. When you talk about infrared photography, light behaves a lot differently in that spectrum of light, and so there's a few key differences to keep in mind. And I haven't delved into all the reasons for it, but it's interesting because you look at foliage, anything that produces photosynthesis, leaves, grass, regardless of what color they normally are. So like if you've got a tree that has dark purple leaves, they'll behave the same as green leaves in that they glow. They reflect almost all infrared light, so they become quite vibrantly illuminated in infrared photography. And so you might have seen a lot of glowing plants in some infrared photographs, and that's the reason why. But they're not the only thing that behaves differently. There's a lot of things that, as you explore that sort of almost parallel universe, you'll find a lot of things that do not quite behave the way you would expect. The sky, for example, will appear quite dark, and the sky will, in most cases, won't reflect or interact with infrared light in any way. So you'll find that the sky stays pretty deep and dark, and I can see you flipping through some images there, Mike. And some of the ones that you've got, like the one that you've got up right now that shows a deep sky. But if you notice, that had the one, it had a sort of a statue, a sculpture called the Spirit Catcher. It's a local landmark here in Barrie. And there was a lot of flare running through the image. And so flare is another thing that can cause issues in infrared. And water reflects very little of it as well. So reflections in water tend to be diminished. And there's all these little things that you'll find in infrared photography that don't behave the same way that you would expect them to in the visible spectrum. One of those things, to get back to your point, is fabrics. And a lot of fabrics, like say I'm wearing a shirt right now that has kind of a stripe pattern on it. But if I were to photograph that in infrared, there's a good chance that that stripe pattern would disappear because those fabrics might behave, or the dyes rather, might behave the same in infrared versus they'll have a difference in the visible spectrum. A lot of blacks turn white. There's a picture of my camera bag in the loop somewhere, and my camera bag is completely black, by the way. But in the infrared spectrum, it appears to be, largely white. And so certain fabrics will behave differently. And to your point about seeing through people's clothing, if the fabric is, if the dye is non-reflective or non-interactive, it might simply let light pass through, and that happens in some rare cases. I know Sony had an issue for quite a while, about 1 or 2 years of production, and this is a few years back, with some of their Handycam cameras that let you turn the infrared mode on in daylight, and there were complaints that the camera could see through clothing. I think that their sales went through the roof.
Yeah, I bet so. And I should say that I was joking about that. I meant it as a funny joke.
No, but there is truth in that joke. And so infrared photography does behave quite a bit differently than regular light. And I'm a science guy, and I'm trying to figure out exactly why this happens and all that kind of stuff. And so it's a wonderful world to explore. The same as macro photography for me, as we discussed previously, where it's a world that we don't recognize. It's a world that we are unfamiliar with, and this is along the same parallel. So it's a lot of fun to dig into and explore.
Yeah, and right now, Don, I am like going through a slideshow of your photos, but I also have them where if we wanted to, I can stop on any one of them. And I have a couple of examples of mine, as long as you won't make fun of me. They're nowhere near as good as yours. But at some point in the show, I want to show, because what I was surprised when I went to take some of my first infrareds is I went to a scene, and what I love about it is I shoot most of my landscape either early morning or late afternoon. Infrared is best in the middle of the day, from what I have experienced.
All other scenes look blah or just terrible. And so it's not friendly for the average photographer to be shooting in the high noon sun because the lighting is just terrible. You don't have a lot of depth to the scene, and it's often very harsh, just like you're saying.
Yeah.
But, for the adventurous photographer, you drop your regular camera, you pick up an infrared camera, and in bright sunlight is when infrared tends to work the best, because the sun is an excellent source of infrared light, especially when there's no clouds, because the clouds reflect it.
Yeah. And I've taken some shots of, let's say, a lake with trees in the background. I have a picture of it. What I couldn't find. I have the befores. I couldn't find the afters, so it's going to be a little bit of a letdown when I show this later. But what I have found is, so you take a picture of, and you're trying to expose either for the sky or for the ground, whatever you're trying to expose for, and either way, you know, I got haze in the sky, and when I took the picture normally, I couldn't even tell there was any clouds in the sky. And when I took it with infrared, and then came home and processed it, it's like, wow, look at this bright, beautiful blue sky that I didn't even know was there.
Yeah, well, clouds reflect a lot of infrared light, so they glow brighter than they normally would in a visible light photograph, as long as you only have a few clouds and you've got a sky behind it.
Sure.
And that sky will appear darker, so the contrast between the two can be much more dramatic.
Yeah, and now you had mentioned earlier, and I don't have a good order to talk about this, but we'll just talk about it. You mentioned earlier about converting a camera. So there is a way where you can convert your camera to be full-time IR. I mean, once you do this, you're committed to that camera being IR. But there's also where you can buy some filters and use filters in front of your lens instead of, so you don't have to commit to taking a camera and making it IR. Is there any,
Right.
is there certain cameras that maybe are better at doing IR than others?
Most are pretty much equal, but I will say that, okay, well, let's explain how a sensor works. Earlier, I had said that a camera sensor is normally sensitive to infrared light and ultraviolet light. But if a camera captured that, then when we looked at an image, it would not look like the world that we see. And so camera manufacturers put a special filter in front of the camera sensor that blocks infrared light and ultraviolet light from entering into the sensor and being recorded, and that's a filter that sits right in front of the sensor, so it looks like it's part of the sensor, like they're sandwiched together, and when you've got that in place, you can't really do much in the way of infrared. The filters are about 98% effective. I'm sort of making that number up, but only a trickle of infrared light can get through. But that's enough. If you can put a filter on the front of your camera lens that blocks out, say, 100% of visible light and only lets in infrared light, then that little trickle, that little 2% or something similar that gets through can be enough to make an image of. And so without modifying your camera, you can experiment with infrared light. But keep in mind that only a small fraction of that light is going to be coming through. And so your exposure lengths get much longer. You'll be pushing 30 seconds, or you'll be cranking your ISO to extremes that you wouldn't normally expect to do in daylight. So it can be done with an unmodified camera, but it takes a bit of patience, a bit of practice. And you will be frustrated because when you're looking through the viewfinder with an infrared filter on your lens, you can't see anything because it's opaque to visible light, right? Except for some very, very deep reds that it still lets through to add a bit of a spectrum of color in the final results. So what you have to do is you have to compose the shot, like get your framing and your composition and everything right. And then you've got to put the filter on and then take the shot. And even then, it's not going to be good.
Right, and I've experienced that too. So you're going out, and I think some people in chat were saying that they thought infrared was night photography. And in this case, you're going. Let's say you go out at noon when it is bright sunny, and you would never think about taking landscape photos out at that time. You go out.
Well, let's answer that misconception first.
Go ahead.
Because when they say infrared associated with night, that's because a lot of security cameras are set to the infrared spectrum. Because if they have gigantic spotlights that beam out infrared light, those spotlights are invisible to us. It will look completely black and dark as night, but the light will be captured by the camera. And so security cameras, night vision cameras as they're called, will have a little infrared light on the front of them and will be able to capture images in complete darkness, or what we see with our own eyes as complete darkness, but the infrared light is still beaming and floating around and the cameras can capture that. So that's where the misconception with night photography and infrared photography will overlap.
Yeah. Yeah, and so, and like you said, you go out. I've gone out there in the middle of the day, put my camera on a tripod. You're going to have to do this on a tripod. Put your camera on a tripod. You have to pre-focus, pre-frame, and then when you put that that filter on top, on the front of it, you're not going to see a thing. It's going to be dark in this bright sunlight, and like you said, you may have a 10, 20, 30-second shutter speed. Depending on how much light and what
But now how do you know how long the shutter should be?
That's a great point. Yeah.
So the meter that's built into your camera is based on visible light. In fact, everything designed around your camera is based on visible light. So a lot of that stuff might not necessarily be accurate. The easiest thing to do would be to take a test shot. And I would start by setting my ISO to around 400 or 800, my shutter speed to 30 seconds, and my aperture as wide as it can be, and just take a shot and see what I get. If it's too bright or too dark, then I will usually adjust either my aperture or my ISO. Because those will have an impact on the scene. Shutter speed, you know what, I can live with a longer shutter speed as long as the image quality gets improved. But just know that anything moving in your scene, even if wind is rustling the trees, then the trees might start to blur at that time. So it's really just guess and test, depending on the time of the year, what time of day, if there's a slight amount of haze or pollution in the sky that might block some infrared light. It's hard to nail down exactly what that exposure will be. But the whole experience is about experimenting, and so manual exposure and try to dial something in that might work, and go from there. But I mentioned the camera is also tuned to visible light, and it's not just the exposure. It's also the focus. And so if you were to focus, even manually focusing through the viewfinder without the infrared filter on, and you put that filter on, your photograph will be out of focus. And that's because infrared light focuses at a different point than visible light.
Oh, God.
So some lenses will have a little conversion thing on. I know that my Canon 24-105 L lens has a little adaptive marking on the lens barrel specifically for infrared photography, but almost no lenses do. And so it's a bit of guess and test to figure that out. You can avoid that guess if you're shooting with live view. However, because so little light is entering the lens, live view is often a completely dark, muddy mess that you can't make out any details on. I'm shooting with, like, my main camera that's not infrared modified is a Canon 1DX, so that's sort of cream of the crop. And even if I crank live view to its maximum sensitivities, I can just barely make out the details on tree leaves, and I often get those details wrong. So live view is not going to be much help. It's a bit of a challenge. It's one of those things that will slow you down. And if you have to go out with the mindset to take infrared pictures, go out and get the mindset to take one infrared picture, because it will take you a long time to get there, and you'll learn a lot in the process. I've made, I'm going to say, a handful of images with a unmodified camera with a filter in front of it. I think there's one of the photographs in the slideshow that you've got that's sort of a river with trees on either side, and the river sort of flowing down and away from the camera, and that particular image was shot with an unmodified camera and a fairly long exposure. That was about a 4-minute exposure, if I remember correctly.
Is it the one I have up now?
No, it's another one. You're much closer to the waterfront in the other one there, and no, it's with a flowing river. There's a lot of water pictures in infrared photography. And the reason why is because water is a very dynamic shot. No, still a different one.
And I have it, huh?
You've got it, I'm pretty sure. It's going to be one photographed with the 1DX, and I think that's one of them. Yep. So there's another one of the same field. That's a waterfall. That's actually a 16-minute exposure. The one
that's
that you've got
16-minute? What time of the day was this one? 16. What time of the day was this?
Like 1 in the afternoon with bright sunlight.
Wow. Okay, so that brings up the next, the next question I have for you is there's also different filters you can get. And, of course, if you're buying a filter and not having your camera converted, you can buy different filters that let in different amounts of infrared. If you're converting it, you're going to have to make a decision on which one that is.
Right.
Do you know what filter you're using to take these?
If you're looking at getting into this stuff, I recommend Hoya makes one that they call the R72 infrared filter.
That's the one I have.
And it's named that because it cuts off the visible spectrum at 720 nanometers or thereabouts. And so it lets a small bit of visible light through, and then the rest of it is infrared to as deep as the camera sensor can capture. And because it lets in a small amount of visible light, it allows you to, yeah, that's the river one that I was originally mentioning, that one there, and that's a 4-minute exposure. But
4 minute. Wow.
in the case of that filter, which that image was taken with, you have to do all the trouble that I mentioned, and you have to deal with all the frustrations. But you'll notice that there are some slight color tones and changes within there, and that's because the infrared spectrum, coupled with a little bit of the visible spectrum, has some differing wavelengths of light. And so even if some of those are beyond our vision, the camera can remap them by color balance adjustments back into the visible spectrum. And so you have non-existent colors that now become existent. And this becomes really interesting as an infrared photographer, because now you're dealing with imaginary colors. And so you are an artist at this point, as all photographers should be, but
Yeah.
you have the creative choice to take those imaginary colors and map them any way that you want. And with most of my infrared work, I choose to do some complicated editing that takes the sky and makes it blue.
Mm-hmm.
And so it makes it just a little bit more familiar to the world that we see. These are probably imaginary colors anyhow, so I could make it green or purple or orange for all I care.
Right.
And in some cases, the scene might justify that. But the most familiar ones have a sort of a blue sky background.
Sure. And never mind. Let me show you a couple of mine. What I was talking about.
Yeah, I'd like to see.
And here's a challenge when you're watching this. So I have two where I tried to take it normally. Just I didn't mean for this to be a good shot. It was just, hey, this is what it looks like non-infrared. Here's what it's going to look like infrared. And so, but the problem is I don't have the exact one. So they're in the same area. It's just a different scene. So when it changes just slightly, and you go, wait, that's not exactly the same spot. Please ignore that. It's in the same day, just a little bit different. So what I was doing with this one is, hold on, okay, yeah. I was trying to expose a little bit more for the sky. You can see totally uninteresting shot. Forget the duck in the middle. This was just to show what was going on. The trees are still not exposed well. The sky, you can barely make out any kind of clouds, right?
Right. And so this is the joy of infrared photography, because you look at this scene with your own eyes, and it is boring.
Yeah.
It's not very interesting in any way. There's no main subject, there's no draw, there's no grab.
There's nothing.
But if you'd photograph something the same or similar, as you've got a slightly different example, the scene takes on like a fantasy world appeal, and there's a certain fascination factor that just really impacts onto anybody viewing it.
Yeah, and so
So
here,
let's see that.
wait, hold on. I got one intermediate one.
Okay.
Here is the next one, and this one is the same area, but more exposed for the trees. And you can see the tops of them are getting blown out. You can't tell there's any clouds whatsoever in the sky.
Right.
It's just totally horrible.
Right.
Then I have the infrared one, and do you mind if I show them the before editing and then and
Go
after?
for it.
Okay. So before editing, what comes out of the camera is more like this.
Yes. Oh, it's disgusting, isn't it?
It's this horrible red. But look what you can already see. Again, it's a slightly different part of the lake. But what you can see is, wow, I didn't even know those clouds were really there.
Yeah.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? And then I did it like you were talking about. I converted it to be more blue.
Yes.
And
there
it
you go.
ends up looking like this in the end.
And
That looks great. I like that.
Yeah, so
it's a wonderful
Right. It's a
appeal.
very surreal
still
photo.
nothing really that interesting about the shot in general. If you wipe away the infrared, there's no reason to take this shot. But the infrared.
But it's funny. If you, I think you've got a picture that's a vertical shot that I've taken that has just a tree standing in it.
Yep.
And it's one of those shots that it is the most boring scene imaginable. But that tree in infrared has a life of its own. It has a certain character that I just find almost, quintessential in a certain way.
Almost like the trees on fire.
Almost like the tree's on fire, or maybe it's
snow.
a lot of people comment that it's covered in frost. And so we've got some
This shot?
some winter weather that comes up.
No.
That's one of them, yeah. And so the tree just glows. In that case, this particular image, I was mentioning a vertical one, but that one there has a lawnmower bicycle in the frame. If you look closely at the bicycle, its front wheel is replaced with a hand-pushed lawnmower apparatus, and it was kind of a fun little thing to I staged the shot. I put the little bicycle thing
Hang on,
there.
let me get rid of your picture. There we go. So now,
Yeah.
now you can see the bicycle better.
Yeah, yeah. And so that's one of those fun little things that I like to experiment with and sort of build a scene. This again was one of those scenes that would have been pretty boring in the visible spectrum. The greens and the blues wouldn't have been all that impactful, but when you throw it to infrared, the sky surrounded by the white leaves adds so much beautiful and surreal contrast that it adds up to a nice image.
Yeah, and I don't know. Oh, okay. This one might have been the one you were talking about.
Yeah, that's the one that I was talking about. That tree is boring. That tree really doesn't have any oomph as a photographic subject unless it's in infrared or you're doing something else fun with it like star trails and that kind of stuff, which I might
Yeah.
experiment with at some point. But it's like 2 blocks away, so it's a fun little subject to go and experiment and try different things on and that's what infrared's really good at. It's
Yeah.
letting you experiment. And sometimes I'll take that camera with me and maybe I'm going for a hike and I'll have it in my hands and I'll periodically just out of curiosity hold it up, press live view on my modified camera and just look at the world in this new kind of light. And sometimes not even take a picture. It's just to see how, the curiosities of how things look.
Yeah, and going back to how you can do them differently. I showed you this one. I also edited that same photo to be a little bit different, or actually it's a slightly different photo, but that same spot to have a different look to it. No longer has the blue sky, the trees are no longer white. I love blue, so I'm actually partial to the other one.
And me too. I find sometimes if you make the trees more magenta in infrared, that makes a nice complement to the blue. It makes it still a little bit more surreal. In this case, it definitely has a feel. It almost feels a little bit more like it's autumn in this particular case, just because of the warmer tones. And but you've proven a good point, because what you're doing there is you're saying, the photographer is the artist, and if you're being the artist, then you can choose any color you could imagine. There's no preference one way or the other. It all just, whatever feels good.
Yeah, yep. And one thing we haven't discussed is setting white balance. We talked about the troubles you're going to run into with the long shutter speeds. The fact you can't see through the lens. You get, I saw that. I showed you that crazy red image.
Yeah,
so
that's what it would look like if you didn't set your white balance. If you set it to automatic or any other setting, really, it's all going to look horribly red.
Yeah.
And so what you have to do is, if your goal is to have the trees being a neutral color, then point the camera at a patch of grass, because the grass is going to have roughly the same tonal range as the trees will, because they're both producing photosynthesis and the like. And so point that at a patch of grass. Depending on the camera model, the custom white balance feature is going to work a little bit differently. I know on Canon cameras, you take a picture and then you go into the menus and you can use that picture to create a custom white balance, and then you have to set the camera to that custom white balance. Other cameras will let you take the picture during the setting process. Just reference your manual if you're curious about doing that and you haven't done it before. But once you've done that, then you will be able to see a much more accurate rendition of the scene. It's still going to look kind of iffy because you're going to have usually a yellowish or orangish sky, but the colors are not going to be so garish. It's going to be a little bit closer to what you need it to be.
Yeah. Yeah, and so that sometimes seems wrong. When you go to a scene, you're going to be taking this landscape scene. You're used to setting your white balance. Maybe you know what the white balance is at the middle of the day, and you set a Kelvin temperature, or you bring a gray card or an expo disc and all that stuff. None of that's going to work right.
Throw it out the window, yeah.
Yeah, you're going to have to take, I often do what you just said, is I take a white balance setting off the grass.
And well, because I've modified a specific camera, I keep that custom white balance always locked in.
Yeah.
And maybe we could talk about that option for people out there. If I'd always recommend buying a filter and experimenting with this. And if it's something that that tickles your fancy, if you kind of get bit by the bug of it, then what you can do is you can take any digital SLR, preferably one with live view, because it makes the focusing and it makes the composition a lot easier when you can see it all in infrared. You can take that camera and get it modified. So what they do is you send it away professionally. I've used a company called LifePixel, but I'm sure there are others. And what they do is they remove that filter from in front of the sensor that blocks infrared and ultraviolet. and they replace it with a special one and you can get all sorts of different options. And I can see you've got the website up there with all the different choices. The standard filter is very similar to the Hoya R72 filter that I've used. And so I stick with that, and it does some pretty cool stuff. You can amplify the colors if you want to play more with color. You can push it to black and white and boost up the contrast if you want to do it that way. And infrared looks good either way. And so what they do is they put this filter on in place that blocks visible and ultraviolet, but only lets through that infrared spectrum. So if you look through the viewfinder, you will see the world as you normally see it. But the camera, the light that it's going to capture is only the infrared spectrum. So this camera is now only dedicated to this purpose, and so you have to make a commitment here, and it's not cheap. You know, it might cost you $350 to $450 is the usual price range, and that's on top of the cost of this camera that's now being dedicated to this use. But it's a wonderful thing to explore, and if you factor it into the cost of a good lens, it's about on par. You know, I mean, depending on the camera that you're using, and it not only allows you to take a different length of picture if you're buying a telephoto lens or a macro lens or something, it lets you explore a completely different world of photography. So I find it more valuable than a different lens altogether.
Yeah, and so what I'm going to do, and I'm glad you're here tonight, so I can maybe get your opinion on this. I'm going to take my first digital SLR was a D100, and it's one of the ones that will be good it's good with a filter, but I'd like to make it full-time infrared. So I've been looking at what I can't decide on, because once I choose this, I'm stuck, is which one of these. And you said the standard RR. I keep going to the enhanced, saying, "Ooh, that looks good too. I'd like to have that." But then can I get to the enhanced look by starting with the standard? Or
Sure. I mean, I find that the standard gives you more of an infrared glow to things, and it gives you more of the infrared sense where fabrics are different, where I took a picture of somebody wearing some mirrored sunglasses and the mirror effect goes away. And so there's all sorts of interesting things in that spectrum that become diminished when you use the enhanced filter because it's letting more visible light through.
Okay.
If you take the standard filter, you can amplify the color, and you can push the colors any which way you want, just the same as you would normally edit any picture out of your camera with the Hoya filter. So you have a lot of flexibility there, but it keeps the infrared impact that would be hard to figure out any other way. And so I would go for the standard. They also have a deep infrared that cuts off all visible light, and they make it black and white. But I kind of like the false color stuff, and so it's kind of the sweet spot. You can increase the saturation and push colors any which way you want, or you can make it black and white. And so I've used the standard one, and it works well for me.
Okay, so you think I should go with the standard one, and I'm looking now at it, and it looks like it's cutting off part of the page here. But for me, it was going to be $275 for that camera.
Right. Now keep in mind with the D100, I'm pretty sure you don't have live view on that.
I do not.
So in that case, you still have the challenge of focus. Because if you focus the camera normally and take the picture, your focus is going to be off. So you might have to do a little bit of hunting back and forth when you're taking the picture to make sure that your focus is set properly. But you also have the advantage of shooting at a much smaller aperture so that you have a greater depth of field, and that can add a little bit of a fudge factor in there as well.
They do have a thing here called lens calibration.
Now you're going to dedicate not only a camera but also a lens just to the infrared work too.
If I do that, I'm locked into that lens, right?
Well, I mean, you could use other lenses, but you'd still have to do the manual guesswork of offsetting it. But then if you take that lens and try to use it on a normal camera, things might not work the way you'd expect. So
they're going to actually adjust the lens?
I think they do, and I'm not 100% certain on exactly how.
I don't want to do that then.
Yeah. But if they don't adjust the lens and they adjust the camera based on that lens, then things get a little... I'm not sure exactly what technology that they would use on an older camera. On newer ones, they can use the micro autofocus adjustment. On older ones, they might have some technology to adjust the position of the sensor inside the camera body. But I don't know if they could do that easily because the camera sensor is attached to the main board inside the camera, and so they might work some magic some other way. But just be wary about then sending them a lens as well.
Yeah.
So now when you're using a converted camera as opposed to a filter in front of the lens, you're shooting with more normal exposure times then as well?
Yes, so you can handhold the infrared shots when you're shooting with a converted camera because you've got a lot more infrared light coming through.
So that's a major convenience right there.
It's a major convenience. Now, Mike, on your camera, if you get a D100 converted, not only will your focus be off, but your exposure will also be off as well because the camera's metering is based on visible light. And so it will be getting a lot of visible light coming in, giving you an exposure, and that exposure might be wrong. So you'd have to do some manual exposure tweaking and figuring out there too. Whereas if you're using live view on most modern cameras, the exposure is not taken from the exposure sensor, because there's a separate sensor in most cameras that figure out what the exposure should be. It's taken from the sensor itself. And so in that case, it's going to be metering based on the infrared light rather than the visible light. So again, this goes in the favor of having a camera with live view capabilities for the infrared work. And I'm not going to say you can't do it, Mike, but you're going to still have a bunch of challenges without live view.
It's the only camera that I'm willing to give up for that. So would you, in that case, would you say I should just stick with the, well, yeah, here's the thing. I don't use the D100 for anything now. Because I have the D2X, which I really don't use that anymore either, because I have the D700. So I'm thinking, what should I do with this thing? I could give it to somebody. I could give it to one of my kids, or I can convert it, or I can just continue to use it with the filter. What would you suggest there?
That's a hard call. I mean, I get better results, far better results from my converted camera.
Okay.
And even if you had a converted camera and you still had to do all the troublesome work to get a good shot, you'd still get far better quality images as a result. And so, if you're willing to put in the effort, then convert the camera, and you'll still have some fun with it.
Okay. So everything we've talked about so far, all the challenges we talked about so far, and they're, to me, they're fun challenges. That part is the fun challenge. Getting out there, the fact I'm taking a landscape shot in the middle of the day, and it's going to take me, 6 seconds. A lot of mine seem to be around 6 to 20 seconds, somewhere in that range, but they can get longer, with that. And I don't have it figured out on exactly the timing. I just have to take a whole bunch of shots and look for one that looks right. All those challenges, now you've got to do the processing. Can I just load this thing in Lightroom and go with it? Or am I going to have challenges there too?
You won't get very far, though.
Hey, you can always load it, yeah.
So one of the big challenges with Lightroom, and this might not be true for all software. I know Aperture behaves better with infrared images than it does with Lightroom. But if you're doing infrared work, Lightroom is hard-coded to only let the color temperature go down to 2000 Kelvin.
Right.
And normally, if you take any normal shot and you drag the color temperature down to there, it is just painfully, disgustingly blue, just like the infrared shot was the same to be red. But to make that horrible redness go down to something more neutral, you have to go well below 2000 Kelvin. And so you have to, when it loads into Lightroom, Lightroom will default to its lowest setting. It disregards your custom white balance setting because it can't get there. And it'll just go down to whatever the lowest setting is that it can, which is 2000. And it's not cold enough. It's still very, very magenta and red and orange. And cameras behave slightly differently, but it's not what it should be.
Yeah.
And so there's two ways around this. In Lightroom, you can play around. If you go down to the very last section that you very rarely will play with, called, I think it's calibration, and you've got red, green, and blue primaries, and you can mess with those sliders to make things accurate. Or what I do is I use a tool that Adobe offers called their DNG Profile Creator. And this is a special tool that you'll almost never use for any other purpose.
Yeah.
I mean, unless you're really, really into some color calibration stuff and something's wonky with you. But for infrared work, what it does is one of the options in there lets you set the white balance default value, and you can just drag that slider to -100. And so for this, it's a bit of a convoluted process. There are some tutorials online. Maybe you could link to one that show how it works. But basically, you convert one of your infrared images to a DNG file so that the software can read it and open it. And then you open it up and you change this white balance slider to -100. and then you save this calibration profile out to the spot in your computer where these types of files are stored. And then you close down Lightroom and open it again. You go back to that same file. And at the very bottom in that calibration setting, you've got, normally you can choose, like for my camera, Canon has picture style settings like faithful and neutral and landscape and vivid and all those kinds of things. But in that list now, I've got one specifically for infrared because I created it in this profile creator software. And if I choose that, then now my white balance preset is going to be, more available. It's going to be exactly what the camera had originally displayed, and from there I can start the task of making the sky blue, which is another challenge in and of itself because Lightroom can't do that. Lightroom, when you're in the hue, saturation, and luminance adjustments, they're very powerful settings, but they'll only let you switch the hue. Say if you've got orange, you can make the orange yellow and you can make it red, but you can't make it blue.
Right.
And so what you have to do is you have to take the red color channel and swap it with the blue color channel. And that's something Lightroom cannot do. Right. That's something that you have to use Photoshop to dive into that whole can of worms and start doing channel swapping. And I don't know if we want to get too deeply into that.
Sure. So back in the day when I first started doing this, Nikon, the software that came with the camera, Nikon, it allowed me to go to those extremely low white balance settings. So I was able to do it with that.
And the Canon software can do it too.
Yeah.
The Canon Digital Photo Professional will do it. But not many people these days will use that software to edit those images.
I haven't had that loaded on a computer in years. So I'm sure I got it somewhere, but I don't use it at all. And so really you really need to do your infrared editing in Photoshop rather than in Lightroom because you're going to have that channel swapping you're talking about is much easier and effective in Photoshop.
That's right. Now, Camera Raw is going to have the same limitation as far as the white balance setting that Lightroom has. They're working sort of off of the same engine.
Right.
And so you'll still have to set up that custom profile and turn that on for your infrared work. But to get the sky blue, if that's what you want, I mean, you might want to make it a black and white infrared, and those look beautiful too. I think I gave you an example of a truck in a field, and that was a black and white image. And so that was a fun little experiment in black and white infrared, and it's got a nice sort of classic appeal to it. Yeah, there it is. And so that's, oddly enough, okay, so this is another great image to bring up for this purpose. That truck in visible light is green. And so people think that, oh, well, infrared is easy. All you have to do is take a visible light picture and brighten up the greens and darken down the blues, and you've got yourself an infrared shot. But what if you've got a person in a green shirt standing next to a green truck in a field of green grass? Well, if you just boost the green, then everything just goes white. But in infrared, all of those things will behave differently in and of themselves. And this truck stayed pretty nice and dark, and I was able to play around with some nice contrasty edges in a field of grass that was glowing around it, and a tree line in the background and the sky being nice and dark and bringing out the clouds. So infrared behaves differently. It's not just taking the blues and darkening them and the greens and brightening them and making it a black and white image. But black and white can work well. You don't have to go through all the rigmarole if you don't want to. But if you do, in Photoshop, not many people usually play around with swapping channels or editing channels individually on their own. It's more of an advanced feature, and if you're not too familiar with Photoshop, it might be a bit off-putting, but it's really pretty simple. In Photoshop, if you're familiar, and I'm pretty sure this can only be done in the full version of Photoshop. Sorry for everybody using Elements. But in the Layers panel, you've got the layers, you've got challenges, and challenges. It is a challenge, but channels.
Yeah. And
you've got paths as different tabs. And if you go into channels, and I usually start with the red channel, I right-click on the red channel, and I duplicate it. And if I duplicate that red channel, it creates a fourth channel, a copy of red. And you need that because what you're about to do now is you're going to take the blue channel and you're going to copy everything that's on the screen, every pixel. So grab any of your selection tools and press Control or Command A, and that's select all, and then copy it, and then paste it over top of the red channel. So you're copying blue over top of red. And now you have to copy red over top of blue. But wait a minute, you just destroyed red. in that process, right? And that's why we made a copy of it, so that you can go to your copy of red that still exists and copy that over top of blue. So the duplicate that you made is just sort of a swap. And then you've now replaced red and blue. And then if you look back at your image, things are closer to the way they should be.
Yeah.
Your sky's probably going to be like cyan or turquoise or something similar, and your trees might have some color. But, just get friendly with your hue and saturation controls in Photoshop, and you can control the cyan, or even Lightroom at this point. You can save it and go back to Lightroom. And you can adjust the cyans to be more blue. You can take the saturations of the magentas or the pinks that the trees might be, and you can drop that saturation down to give you that nice white glow. And then with whatever tools you're familiar with, you can build it out from there. And so that one swap mechanism is something that Lightroom is just not capable of doing. And I don't know if it ever will be, because Lightroom doesn't deal with pixels per se. At least its core engine when you're dealing with raw data. Raw data is not pixels. It's an array of red, green, and blue. And you can't swap the channels, at least not nearly as easily as you might think. It's not part of the fundamental technology that is built into the software. They'd have to redesign it from scratch, and they're not going to do that. So Photoshop is where you need to make that edit.
And so I've never actually done it that way, the way you just mentioned. That's very interesting.
Well, how do you do it then?
So I go into the channel mixer, and I had pulled that up, and then I got rid of it when I realized that's not where we're going.
Oh, well, Channel Mixer does the same thing.
Okay.
Except for what I'm doing, I've got it set up as an action.
Yeah.
And so I don't know if I can set up Channel Mixer as an action. I probably can. But so I just press a button and it swaps them.
Okay.
I actually have that set to a keyboard shortcut.
Wow.
So while I described it, I've only ever done that once. Twice, because I did it once and I said, okay, well, that's something that's actionable. And then I set up an action, made it a keyboard shortcut, and now I just press whatever it is, Control Shift and plus or something weird that I've got it set to. And then it just swaps them and away I go. So it's a big time saver when I can just action it.
Right.
Same results though. If you take the channel mixer, and I think that if you take the blue and you minus it and the red and you plus it, or vice versa, and then it's the same effect.
Yeah, I think if you go to the red and you make the blue 100% and the red 0, and then you go to the blue and you do just the opposite, make the red 100% and the blue 0, you've basically swapped those channels.
6 of one, half dozen of the other.
Yeah, so the one interesting with your way is, aren't you creating multiple layers, and now you could actually do things on those layers if you wanted to?
Well, you always have 3 channels when you're dealing with any image that's RGB, right? You always have a red, green, and blue. And so you can edit images, any image, period, based on what color channel you happen to be working in. Editing based on color channels is incredibly powerful, but you have to know what you're doing. You have to know how RGB combines into the visible image that you see before editing them to any extreme makes sense. But just swapping them around can be a useful tool.
Okay. Now, you have one photo, and I'm gonna pull it up here now. There we go. Okay, had a little bit of a pause there in the software. One where you have people in it, and so this obviously is not a long exposure one. This is with your modified version.
That's right.
And what I've not done any with people in it, because in what I have found in most cases, the people ones don't come out very well when I take them, because I'm having to have these long exposures. But this one I think this is an interesting shot with the people. You got the trees in there, the white. You got the people, and you got the ocean or whatever that is in the background.
That's Lake Ontario. This was taken on Toronto Island on a photo walk, actually, where I just had my infrared camera handy. And so you see a lot of the people in this image. And the reason why this one works better than most is because nobody's looking at the camera. And you can't see anybody's eyes.
Okay.
Eyes look really creepy in infrared because the iris of your eye usually goes pretty dark. And so your eye becomes much darker than it normally would be. And your skin becomes more blemish-free. It's interesting the way infrared light behaves in the skin. If you have freckles, your freckles will likely disappear or become greatly diminished. Any blemishes that you have will be smoothed out.
Wow.
So with that effect and dark eyes, you look a little bit like a vampire. And so I should have thrown in an image of people that look that way. I've got one of myself, actually. I need to do a better one because it's kind of creepy and fun. But, some people have used it at weddings. As long as like the bride and groom are kissing, maybe their eyes are closed. It gives a really nice feel to their skin. Especially if you're processing it in black and white and doing some interesting things with that. But you're right, people photography in infrared is a little bit tricky. The reason why I threw this one in here is because a lot of people that you see wearing white were wearing black. The camera bags were also black. So a lot of fabrics were glowing quite brightly in infrared. And, in some cases that makes sense, especially for camera bags. If I have my camera bag and black is a nice sleek look, but I don't want my camera gear to cook inside. So the dye is absorbent to the visible light, so it looks black, but it reflects infrared, so it doesn't absorb as much heat. And while it will still get hot, it won't get as hot as, say, the fabric absorbing infrared light as well.
Yeah.
Now, it's interesting, too, because one of the things that I want to try and play around with is photographing snowflakes in infrared. But the black mitten that I use as the background for my snowflakes, it's reflective in infrared, and so the black mitten turns white and the snowflakes get lost in the background. So I did some hunting and I finally found a wool that absorbs infrared, so it stays black, and I'll be using that to I've enlisted my grandmother to knit me a mitten, and so she's probably working on that right now.
Well, now, what is that going to do to the snowflake?
I don't know, but that's what I'm going to find out.
Huh. Well, I can't wait to see that.
It's probably going to be pretty boring. Like it's probably not going to look much different at all. But the fact that I haven't done it makes me want to try it.
Absolutely. I mean, that is the thing. If you got to try it before you know what it's going to do. I mean, if you don't, I'm having trouble right now envisioning what's going to happen. But that is the beauty. Just do it and see what happens.
Yeah. And I photographed that mitten and I realized that while the mitten appears quite bright, the fibers are actually kind of transparent as well, and so the dye is just almost as if it's not there. And so it's kind of interesting when you see this kind of stuff. Infrared photography reveals a little bit onto how the world works and why things happen the way they do, and how things are designed. There's two more images that I want to mention in here if we've got time.
Sure. Yeah, go ahead.
And one of them that I had sent you, actually I sent you a few of them that have a lot of flare in them. And if you could bring up one of those, doesn't really matter which one, but it makes a point that, that's a good one. So this was taken with a fisheye lens that has a 5-blade aperture, and you can see that the flare takes on that same shape.
Yeah.
You've got the 5 blades making pentagonal flare in that. This particular image, when taken in the visible spectrum of light, has a tiny little bit of flare, but almost nothing compared to what you're seeing here. And this tells me how a camera is designed, or a lens is designed rather. Because lenses are designed with anti-reflective coatings on them. Mm-hmm. And these coatings are specifically engineered using the principles of thin film interference. And without getting too technical, they're dependent on specific wavelengths of light. And they're engineered to work at specific wavelengths, and that's how they become anti-reflective. And because of that, they're not engineered to work in the infrared spectrum. So using a regular old lens to photograph in infrared will be as if you're using that lens with no anti-reflective coatings on it, because they're not engineered for that purpose. So if you're shooting into the sun, or there's another shot I think I sent that was shooting into the moon. Moon. Yeah, it was a vertical shot that had flare kind of coming across diagonally.
All right.
I'm not sure if I sent you that one or not. I've got so many experiments with this kind of work. But in any case, any bright object is going to create, there you go, massive amounts of flare.
Wow.
And so that's the moon creating flare.
That's the moon doing that?
That's the moon doing that.
Wow.
That's a night shot. So you can do infrared stuff at night too.
Really?
And it's a lot of fun. Yeah.
That's probably just with a converted camera. I got to imagine.
That's with a converted camera. Yeah. If you were doing that with an unconverted camera, your exposure would be like 3 hours long.
Yeah, it'd be the next day.
Yeah.
Pack a lunch.
Exactly. or maybe even longer, the way that exposures would collect light, in that diminished form, because that was taken at, I think, ISO 1600 or 3200, and a 25-second exposure or something similar,
Wow.
in order to get that exposure to work. But it just proves the point that flare is always going to be a presence in these photographs. And there was one photo that has me standing underneath a lighthouse, and it's a fisheye image. And I put that one in there also to describe flare, because in this case, I've hidden the sun behind the top of the lighthouse.
Is that this one?
And yeah, that's that one.
Okay.
And so in that case, I now have the ability to have a normal looking image with the sun kind of in the frame, but it's sort of hidden. And as soon as I hide the main point of light, the flares will disappear. And so you can be creative with it. You can choose to include it or ignore it. You can use it as a creative tool, or just learn to avoid it.
And wait, who is that in the picture?
That's me. That's a selfie.
So what did you do? Just set it on a timer and then go stand out there?
Yeah, I set it on a 10-second timer. Then I ran out and sort of looked up at the tower, and then I realized I wasn't standing right, and I did that again 5 or 6 times.
So you're relatively close then if this is a fisheye lens.
I'm pretty close. Yeah, I'm maybe 15 feet away.
So actually, this is one of my favorite ones of the ones you sent. I love the sky in this one. I love the sun behind the light. I didn't realize it was a lighthouse. But
that is the Gibraltar Point Lighthouse on Toronto Island.
Okay.
It's a wonderful place to go and visit. The door on that lighthouse is bright red, but of course in infrared you're not going to find much in the way of color, and paint pigments and things like that don't really behave properly anyhow. They're just usually monochrome.
It's very odd to see a lighthouse with trees around it. I'm not used to that.
Yeah, well, this lighthouse is slightly more inland than the shoreline, because the shore, I think, was actually extended at one point. This lighthouse is very old, and they added ground onto Toronto Island, and so this is now that the actual shoreline is probably around 200 feet away.
Okay. Yeah, it looked like it was more inland. So how tall is that thing?
Well, I mean, I'm standing there and I'm 5'10", so you can kind of do the math and figure that out.
60, 70 feet.
Yeah.
Something like that.
Yeah. Yeah. To me, infrared photography gives, when I shoot so much landscape. I do all this landscape stuff, and it's a good way to do something different.
It is. I find myself getting bored by some of the scenes that are right around here. Scenes that I might have been to a handful of times. There's some great waterfalls around here that I like to go and kind of just shoot, even though I've shot many times before, just to relax. And I find myself going back and back, but it might get a little bit more boring. It changes from time to time, but it's never going to be unique. It's never going to be like I'm going somewhere new. And so shooting in infrared, it's like I've never been there before.
Right. It totally, all the landscape you shot before is going to look totally different when you go to shoot it infrared.
And landscapes that you thought were completely boring are now magical.
Exactly. Like the one I showed earlier. I mean, if you saw how boring, it really is that boring when you're standing there. I mean, it's nothing. And the other thing I found is where the sky is hazy and I couldn't see the clouds very well, that infrared just cuts right through all that haze, and it's just gone.
Yeah. It behaves very, very differently.
Yeah.
And it's important to know that it's not just certain colors get bright and certain colors get dark. It's a completely different spectrum of light, and you have to kind of treat it that way. In some ways, too, there's other challenges as well. I think I put in a picture that is mostly blue-toned. It's a boardwalk going through a swamp, but there's some orange fringing around the outside edges. And if you bring that up, I put that one in there because that one shows an example of a problem that a lot of photographers might encounter, and that is light leaking, which is not a term you usually hear in digital photography.
Yeah.
But this is taken with, I think it was a 1DX. And that is light leaking back in through my eyepiece when I'm making the exposure.
I've never actually seen it happen.
So you hear about it.
Do you close the? Do you close? I close the little shutter thing on my lens. The eyepiece.
Yeah, so you can close the shutter if your camera has one. If your camera doesn't have one, I know Canon cameras have a little rubber piece on their camera straps, and you can kind of take off the eye cup and put that little piece over top. That's what it's for. And so you have to block that, because if you're blocking out 100% of the visible light and you're cranking your ISO up and you're doing very long exposures in bright daylight, enough visible light is going to leak backwards in through your eyepiece that it's going to hit the sensor and it's going to muck up your shot. Now, that to some degree it's going to happen to every image, but it's impossible to notice it. I'm sure even lab tests would have a hard time picking it up if you're just shooting in visible light. But as soon as you're in infrared, any visible light coming into the camera is going to cause a little bit of chaos for you. And it took me a long time to figure out what the heck was going on here. And then I closed down the little eyepiece, because the 1D series from Canon has a little lock on it as well. And I closed that off, and lo and behold, it went away. And so I went, aha, there we go. There's another problem solved.
And what's interesting in this shot is it's coming in from the left, but then you have the two marks at the bottom also.
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly. It's probably coming in from the left based on the angle that the sun was and hitting and bouncing around a little bit. The two marks on the bottom might have been it hitting off of something else that's reflective, maybe something attached to the focusing screen or something inside the camera.
Really,
anytime
you're going to do a long exposure, whether it's infrared or non-infrared, I close down that eyepice.
It's helpful. I mean, at the very least, it does nothing. So, I mean, you can't hurt anything by doing it. And I've noticed, too, there was one lens, I think I was renting it. It was a Canon 50mm f1.2. And I was shooting with that lens just to experiment and play around with infrared and some long exposure night stuff and having just some fun with extremely wide apertures. But I noticed that that lens on the camera for infrared work had a very similar light leak. And if I covered up the connector where the camera and the lens interconnect, if I just put my hands over that or draped anything over top of it, that effect went away. And so light was actually leaking in through the lens mount somehow. I can't figure out how that light was getting in through there, but something was. And it was enough that was causing some problems in the final image. And so just be aware that light leaks will exist in infrared photography, and be prepared for them.
Right. Yep. And talking about the filters, let's go back to the filters, because I just looked it up. Because I remember when I was looking at infrared filters, there were some that were really expensive, hundreds of dollars.
Oh yeah.
And I have, like you mentioned, I had the Hoya 72 infrared. Now you got to get it for whatever lens you're going to have. I right now have the one pulled up that's the 72mm. So whatever your front element is, and you need it for that. In this case, Amazon has it for 138, 139.
I bought the same filter in a 77mm filter thread, and of course that price goes up to around the $200 price point at that point. And so it's worth noting that it's not going to be cheap on every lens, but it's worthwhile experimenting with a smaller filter. So if you've got like a 50mm lens, like the Canon 50mm f1.8 works pretty well for infrared work. And so you can take that, buy, I think it's a 52mm filter thread on that kind of a lens. And the smaller the filter, the less expensive it becomes, and then it's worth experimenting with at that point. Especially because those prime lenses tend to be a bit faster, and you can shoot at wider apertures, and your shutter speeds are a little bit, more behavable. Things will not be as extreme. You might even be able to get some live view performance out of a prime lens. So it's worth considering experimenting with that first.
And I pulled up the 52mm, and it's let's say $90. And I've noticed the same thing as you is as you start increasing the millimeters on the filter, when you get, there's a point. If you graph this, there's a point where it goes from the 72 to the 77, and the price skyrockets, or somewhere in there. Yeah.
I pity those people that have lenses that take an 82mm filter thread, because the price will go up by like another 30 or 40% just for that extra little bit.
Yeah. So it's good to maybe start off with, like you said, with maybe a 50mm with the 52mm thread or whatever that was. You said 52, right? Yeah, 52.
Yeah.
So that you can dip your feet into it before you go and buy a $300 or $200 filter.
Well, I would say use that as your dip your feet into it, and make the decision then if you like this kind of stuff. If you do,
instead.
Then go for the conversion
Yeah.
and just save your money instead of buying the filter at that point. Fine. I've seen people that have a modified. There was a friend of mine that has a modified Canon G series camera. I think it's a G9.
Yeah.
And so he had his point and shoot modified for this. And some
Awesome.
point and shoots can do that. I think LifePixel, they used to do G series cameras. I don't know if they still do. But in that case, he's got his little pocket camera that he can take out and do that with. And so it's a little bit less expensive. And if you've got a small camera bag and a small kit, keeping another small camera around might not break the bank, or at least break your back.
Yeah. And LifePixel has on their site, they have some tutorials on, showing you what the different filters do. They even have a tutorial on self-converting, which I would never do.
Oh God, no.
But I don't know why they would put that there when they're trying to, sell the service of doing it for you.
Oh, well, I think that if you were to buy the filter from them, they make money, and then when you screw it up, they also make money on fixing it for you.
That's probably true. Just about everybody I've heard who's used them, LifePixel, has come away satisfied and thought they did a good job.
Well, and I can say the same. I mean, they did a pretty good job, and I've had no problems with it. They'll preset your white balance, and things work well. It is a bit concerning when it comes time to clean my camera sensor, because instead of looking through and seeing the camera sensor, I just see like this big black box, and I was like, oh geez, what do I do here? And whatever coatings that they apply make these sensor swabs that I have behave a little bit differently, and it takes a bit more finesse to get it nice and clean. So I try not to clean it that often, but it's just par for the course. You gotta take what it is, and
Yeah.
I couldn't be happier shooting infrared. I mean, it's one of those things that if you can photograph anything in visible light, just try it in infrared. I've done like night cityscapes in infrared, and some lights show up, some lights don't. Some lights, like from security cameras, will be beaming. Yeah, there's a good example. That's Toronto, taken in infrared, and the reflections that you'd normally see going across the water are not there because the water's not reflecting it, and
That's right.
and so. The CN Tower, the big tower in the center, has gigantic vertical lights that stream up the entire tower that are invisible in infrared. So things behave differently, and it's a marvel to see these things.
Yeah, if you're watching this in chat, you probably think that the image starts at about midway through the frame there. That there's nothing below the city landscape.
Right, that's what I was thinking when I saw it.
Because it's black.
No, it extends down, and if you were to zoom in, you could see some small ripples in the water and some very, very faint details that might not come across the broadcast. But there is a little bit of detail there. The water just becomes black. There's very little in the way of reflections. And if you're photographing, say, the night sky, and this is something I haven't done yet, but I know stars reflect a lot of infrared light. And I'm sure that some stars might reflect more than others, especially more infrared than visible, for example. So if you photograph the same picture of the night sky, you might see different stars in the sky, or at least different brightnesses of them. And so, yeah, there's lots of fun things to experiment and have fun with.
Okay. Yeah. Well, Don, thank you for coming. We're actually a little bit past the hour, and I know you got to get that number 52 out, and so I don't want to keep you. Thank you for coming on and talking about infrared. Our first time covering infrared. Some wonderful images you have, and if you're not following Don, go over on Google Plus and search for Don. We'll have the link in the show notes. You have over 1 million followers already. Good gosh.
Yeah. It's
that's awesome.
It's quite a big following.
Great job.
Thank you.
And deservedly so. I mean, these are the best snowflake photos I've ever seen, and really all of your work that you do is really great.
And can I do a slight plug here at
absolutely.
the end, too,
Yes.
for my Snowflake book?
Yep.
And so in December, I published a 300-page hardcover book on snowflakes, the science, the photographic techniques, every secret that's in there. All the techniques, the extensive editing workflow, and, of course, hundreds of pages of beautiful images. So if anybody's interested in that kind of work, check out the book, because it's the best resource that a photographer could have for that scale of macro photography, geared to snowflakes, but it's applicable to anything.
And where can they find the book?
At skycrystals.ca.
And I think I have it pulled up right here.
There you go.
Absolutely. Yeah, and for all the details and just for the wonderful images, I mean, that's incredible. We'll post something about this on our Facebook page also, and we'll put the link in our show notes so you can go over and take a look at it.
Perfect. And if you want to see my infrared work, you can check that out at doncom.ca.
Okay. Very good. We'll have that in the show notes too. Well, Don, thank you for coming. We'll have to have you back on at some point again. You're such a great guest. I always enjoy talking to you, and the hour just flies by, and I'm already feeling bad that we've kept you over an hour because I know you got to get
That's
number
all right.
52 out. But
I love talking about this stuff. It's not a concern at all.
yeah, and I love that you were our first guest to talk about infrared because it's something that not a lot of the people I shoot with have ever done it or really have that much of an interest in it. I love the way it turns images and makes them look. So I don't mind going out and doing it by myself, but it's something I'm surprised hasn't caught on more.
Well, I'll close with this thought,
Yeah.
and that in photography, images that get noticed are images that people haven't seen before. Images that have a unique aspect, something that might catch somebody's attention. And in the world of the internet today, in 2014, everything is seen before. Yeah, you've seen that a million times. Nothing has a real fresh appeal to it, and it's hard to find things in photography that generally have an impact, that have something that is truly unique. But because so few people have, in the grand scheme of things, based on the number of photographers out there, a very small percentage have explored infrared photography. And there's so many unique images that are still yet to be made in that field. And I plan to explore it a whole lot more this coming year. So you might even have to have me back on to talk about it again.
Absolutely, yes. And then maybe next time, what we can do is actually do a walkthrough on an edit. I know we talked about it in theory, and you kind of got the idea. Some people are familiar with, fooling with the channels and doing the stuff you talked about, the way your method. So familiar with it, but actually seeing it sometimes helps people a little more. I think, seeing the images and the results that you can get and realizing that this is not in the middle of the night, although you did have a couple of night ones, is more of the middle of the day and what it gives you. And these are not snow scenes. These are scenes in the spring or the fall, spring or the summer, whenever everything looks, nice and green. That gives you an idea of what you can do and what you can expect from it.
Exactly. If you are a fair weather photographer, infrared photography is your best friend.
Absolutely. Yep. And it gives you something to do in the middle of the day.
Exactly.
All right, Don. Well, thank you for coming, and everybody out in chat. I think a few people had some streaming issues. I don't know what was going on there, but the recorded version should be just fine. You can watch it then. We'll have it up on YouTube shortly, and Don, let's hope it does as good as your other one. But I think topping the macro one is going to be hard.
All right. Well, we'll see.
Yeah. If you want to get the recorded version, you can get it, of course, on YouTube. You can get it on iTunes. You can get it on Stitcher Radio. And we love our Stitcher Radio, and we love our Spreaker fans, but you got to come over and see the YouTube version so you can see the actual photos. That's the challenge of listening to it on Spreaker or on Stitcher, which we have a lot of followers coming through that way. A lot of people like to listen to the show as maybe they're driving into work, but this is one of those ones that you want to see the photos so you can get an idea of what we're talking about. You can get that on those things, also on TiVo, and if there's any BlackBerry users out there, you can still get it on BlackBerry and Zune, and I think that's it. If there's someplace you're trying to get it and we don't have it there, let me know, and we'll try to get it out there. But until next week, keep it raw. Good night, everybody.
Good night, everybody.